podcast. First, thanks to Mr. Kalio that give us chance to staying here. And Rani Rohimah, mic is yours.
Okay, thank you to moderator. Okay, I will tell you about developing student listening and speaking skill through ELT podcast. Okay, my name is Rani Rohimah. You can call me Rani. Okay, do you know about the podcast?
No.
Podcasts are audio, sometimes video programs on the web, which are usually updated at regular intervals. New episodes can be listened to on the computer or downloaded to an MP3 player or iPod for later listening. So, podcast have one unique because capacity for subscription. For example, Trop and RSS really simple syndication. Listener can subscribe to their favorite podcast. And type of podcast. Podcasts have two types. The first, radio podcast and independent podcast. Radio podcast program turns into podcast, such as those produced by BBC, British Broadcasting Corporation, and RTHK, Radio Television Hong Kong. An independent podcast is web-based podcast produced by individuals and organizations. It is the second type of podcast which has good potential for ELT because this can be tailor-made to suit the needs of different learners. So between radio podcast and independent podcast is radio podcast. Radio podcast program have existed on the web for a few years already, and independent podcast made to individual or organization. ELT podcast, where to find them? The first podcast appeared in early 2005. ELT educators soon joined the movement, and since the second half of 2005, there has been an upsurge in the number of ELT podcasts off the web. Teachers have their ways to look for suitable ELT podcasts for their students. So, a podcast directory is a searchable database which is linked to cite the house podcast. And then content of ELT podcast. ELT podcast cover a wide range of subject matter. A brief survey of ELT podcast reveals the following content types. The first, comprehensive. The second, who listen, and the third, vocabulary, idioms, etc. And then conversation with script, jokes, songs, phonetics, pronunciation, stories, and listening comprehension. Using ELT podcast to enhance students' listening skill. ELT podcast can be used for intensive and extensive listening activities. However, ELT podcasts are particularly suited for extensive listening. For the purpose of motivating students interested in listening to English and providing them with exposure to native speaker speech. And then ELT podcasts have two teacher and students podcasts. In addition to using podcasts to provide their students with extra listening practice, teachers can also create their own podcasts or guide their students to produce their own. There's two types of podcast will now discuss. Uh, Benefit of student podcast. Producing podcast is a motivating way for students to improve their speaking skill, as will be explained below. And then motivation. Podcast, one place on the web, can be accessed by anyone around the world. This means that for students producing their own podcast, there is a real audience out there. This is a motivating factor. One example of a student podcast is the one produced by secondary and one student at the secondary school at Taiwan University in China. And then perfection through practice and rehearsal. A podcast is permanent record of an oral performance. Being aware of that, student producing a podcast will be more attention to their pronunciation, accuracy, mix ability teaching, and collaboration through group podcast. Collaboration skill have become a key generic skill in the school curriculum in Hong Kong. Development Council 2001. Students can be invited to produce podcasts in groups. Through the process, they learn to collaborate with each other. The conclusion is podcasting as a new technology has great potential in enhancing children's listening and speaking skills. Couple the ease of producing MP3 files, availability of free recording and editing software such as Audacity, and the fact that MP3 player and iPods are owned by the majority of teenagers. Podcasts can be easily created. Their ability to reach large audience in their own location and different parts of the world is an enormous motivator for students to produce their own podcast. Okay, I think that's all. Thank you. I'm sorry for my mistake. Wassalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.
Waalaikumsalam.